what's-done.org. Two completely contrasting examples. One example is about a certain kind of propagation of hate speech on the first website, where basically, a large number of people would get together to make inflammatory statements against minority communities. And then the second one was an instance of a minority community making a declaration on their website that they were seceding from the Republic of India to become a republic of its own. Now, both of these are very interesting because they come from two different ends of the political spectrum, but they seem to, in a way, suggest something common between them, that your performance or your utterance online seems to generate a threat which asks for a demand of real action. Now, this connection between virtuality and what one does in a virtual space and the strict punitive penal action that the state responds with becomes an interesting dichotomy, and I will come back to this a little more. The other significant events were the banning of Blogspot, which took place in 2005. Then there was the Guys for Men case in Meerut. Guys for Men was an extremely popular website in which sexual minorities would contact each other and meet up. Now, this site was under surveillance by the police, and eventually the police actually tapped into the website, set up fake meetings or entrapments, and then arrested people who eventually, responded to the calls on the site. There was the surveillance of the Orkut community on Google. In the last 4 months alone, there have been apparently more than 100 different requests from different police stations across the country asking for user information or tracking user details of people in the Orkut community. And of course, there is the setting up of the different cybercrimes investigation cells in different police stations across the country. So you can see that really there has been a massive surge in this kind of idea of the regulatory, need, as it were, for the net. And I would want to raise a couple of critical questions and concerns that people interested in questions of freedom of speech and expression, people interested in questions of free flow of knowledge would want to, raise for these regulatory concerns. There's a certain ad hoc nature of the way that the regulation of the internet happens in India. If you take, for example, here is a sample of one of the, directions for the banning of Yahoo groups, and this is from 2005, and it's just a simple two-liner, kind of signed by, an official, without any details, without any reasons being given as to why this ban should take place. There is no justification, there is no background information, but a two-liner. These are the rules for cyber cafe licensing, and some of them include the fact that every visitor to a cyber cafe needs to produce an authentic photo ID card. Now, there are serious questions out here. What happens to people who don't have authentic photo ID cards? What indeed are authentic photo ID cards? The recent experiences of getting an election card, for example, has shown the completely flawed process where your gender could be wrong, your name could be wrong, etc. So what it means is that you're actually introducing an entire layer of access restrictions for people who would otherwise have access to public spaces of communication. But to my mind, the relationship between the call for greater regulation of the net really harks back to a much older conflictual relationship between technology and the law. Because if you look at any kind of, the history of any relationship between technology and law, there are always stages to that particular relationship. And the first stage is always a stage of anxiety, followed by an age of consolidation, in the words, of Hobsbawm, followed finally by what I would describe as an age of empire. Now, what do I mean by these three? The age of anxiety is that technology is always faster than the law, and the law is constantly surprised by technology. So, for example, with the invention of the camera, there was really never a legal system in place for questions of the admissibility of photographs as evidence. There was no questions about the copyright, accorded to photographs, etc. So technology always, in a sense, is 2 steps ahead of the law, and it produces a moment of anxiety and produces a moment of surprise for the law. Now, how does the law respond to it? The law, unfortunately, inevitably responds through the only language that it's capable of, which is the language of control, the language of disciplining, and the language of regulation. So rather than understanding the social possibilities opened out by a particular technology or a medium, it inevitably seeks to translate the medium onto its own terms, or into the language of law. And the final phase is the age of empire, where technology, after being disciplined by the law, is then, in a sense, set onto its proper path. And the proper path has inevitably in the history of technology meant a commercial exploitation by a small number of people who end up owning that kind of technology. And I'll try to show you how in the case of the internet this is again very true as well. I would make a distinction between thinking about enabling legislations and regulatory legislations. How do we think about an enabling legislation that actually allows and exploits the technology for its greatest social benefit, versus a regulatory imagination that says that this technology needs to be controlled and governed? And I would say that it flows from two different things. If you were to take, for example, Article 19.1 of the Constitution and Article 19.2, Article 19.1 speaks about freedom of speech and expression, whereas Article 19.2 speaks about the various reasonable restrictions that may be imposed upon speech. If you were to think of the laws that come from this, something like the Cinematograph Act, which is about, the censorship of cinema, is clearly a law that emerges from the imagination of Article 19.2. Something like the Community Radio Guidelines is basically a policy that emerges from Article 19.1, which is about enabling a particular form of communication, enabling a particular kind of speech. And my argument is that when it comes to the net and when it comes to cyberspace, unfortunately, the imagination has been fueled more by Article 19.2 than by Article 19.1. If you look at the way the net has spread over the years, it's just been an incredible growth. I mean, an information revolution of a kind that we haven't really seen before. It's estimated that 13.9% of the world's population have some kind of regular internet access. Of course, it's true that the majority of the users of the net live in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Southeast Asia, etc. And the developing world is just about adopting this, kind of technology. But even there's been some remarkable progress, because if you take the kind of growth in terms of percentage, the highest growth rates have been in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Latin America. Chinese is the second most used language on the internet. And in India, we've seen a growth rate of something like 684% in internet usage, from 5 million people in 2000 to around 39.2 million in early 2005. What is also very interesting about the growth of the internet in India is that the boom is propelled not by the metropolises or the large cities, but actually by the tier 2 towns and cities. So the internet in India is growing really because of the smaller towns and cities. And what it means is that currently there are something like 39 million people in India who have some kind of regular access to the net. So we're talking about an extremely, extremely large amount of people involved in a massive, mode of communication. And it's important for us to pay closer attention to what this communication is about. Because as I said in the beginning, if you look at the three areas of conflict, the first really is the question of jurisdiction, right? Because what the internet does is that, unlike old media, and by old media I mean cinema, radio, television, in many ways old media is marked by the fact that they are one-way or one-sided communication mediums. The internet is actually a two-way medium, where you're not just a listener but also a speaker, where you're not just a reader but also a writer. But what the internet does is that, in terms of jurisdiction, the first challenge that it poses is on the ability of the law and of the state to control time and space. Because traditional media is marked by a very neat relationship to time and space that is controlled by the law. The second area of conflict, of course, is the entire question of anonymity or relative anonymity. There is a saying that no one, on the net, no one knows whether you're male or female, whether you're a human or you're a dog, etc. But this idea of a certain anonymity that has been brought about by the internet poses immense challenges. And the third is the dilution of property rights. Let me address the first one, the question of jurisdiction.